this is one up looking charcuterie board. Or it just might be SNES games on Game Boy Advance. What a concept. You know, I've always loved the Game Boy Advance. You know, it's the handheld I did in fact grow up with. So of course, you know, I love it. But to be completely fair, so much of the Game Boy Advance's identity is because of stuff like this. Pretty early on in its life, the Game Boy Advance kind of had this gumption to it that it was gonna be a Super Nintendo in the palm of your hands, on the go, which kind of feels like that was the goal of the Game Boy line all along. Hear me out here. So many original Game Boy games feel like they were just desperately just clawing at being Super Nintendo games on the go. I mean, we have Super Mario Land 2 6 golden coins here. I mean, I look at the Mario sprite used in this game. It's just like a direct adaptation of the Super Mario World sprite. You have Link's Awakening, which is definitely trying to be kind of like a Game Boy adaptation of A Link to the Past. In fact, I believe this game started as them trying to bring A Link to the Past to the Game Boy. Donkey Kong Land is a Game Boy version of Donkey Kong Country. You know, like these are like unique games, the Donkey Kong Land games, but they're also not they're weirdos. And then on the Game Boy Color, you had stuff like Mega Man Extreme, which is kind of a Game Boy Color version of Mega Man X, and Donkey Kong Country just flat out on the Game Boy Color. This is a Game Boy Color demake of Donkey Kong Country. It's not really like a pseudo-original game like Donkey Kong Land is. But you look at how Donkey Kong Country looks on the Game Boy Color, and it might as well be its own original game because it looks like ass. Now, it was the Game Boy Advance where we could truly experience the art of Super Nintendo games on the go. Kind of. All right, here's problem number one. Why are you making this the Super Nintendo to go when you're not going to give us like 4 face buttons? I will give them this. They introduced the shoulder buttons for the Game Boy line here. You know, that was nice. And obviously all these games could like work with just 2 face buttons, but I'm just kind of asking like, why do we have that limitation, you know? It just kind of felt like with every single one of Nintendo's handhelds throughout history, you could find one of their home consoles that you could kind of directly relate to it. So, you know, the original Game Boy and Game Boy Color, you know, you could relate to the NES. Game Boy Advance Super Nintendo, Nintendo DS was similar to a Nintendo 64 in many ways. And the 3DS, you could directly relate to like the GameCube/Wii in terms of power level. But they almost always weren't as powerful as the console you could relate them to. The screen resolution was lower. The screen size was weirder. Like Super Mario Bros. Deluxe looks exactly like the original NES. But the problem is, the Game Boy screen size is fucked. And the Game Boy Advance suffered from a lot of those same problems. This is an aspect ratio. This is neither 4:3 or true widescreen. It's the Game Boy Advance's screen size, which because the screen size is smaller than TV screens, and it's also just in a different aspect ratio, I don't know. If you're bringing a Super Nintendo game to the Game Boy Advance, like they have to do all kinds of things to like make up for that fact. Like a game like Super Mario World wasn't designed with a screen like this in mind, but you can make it work on a Game Boy Advance, so they kind of have to like scrunch things in. They have to zoom the camera in, so then like, yeah, it'll work better on a Game Boy Advance. In the end, some games work perfectly fine with this screen crunch, but then you have others like platformers, like I said, Super Mario World, where they work fine, but comparing that to the original, it's harder to play. And couple that with the fact that you are lacking 2 buttons from the Super Nintendo controller, you know, it kind of makes it a little strange that they were like, oh yeah, the Super Nintendo to go right here, baby. However, the games could run, and they ran damn well on the Game Boy Advance. And honestly, most of the time, the games they picked to bring to the Game Boy Advance, you know, they didn't really need all those buttons. You can make do with what the GBA had. And I think the first ones to talk about here are obviously some of the Mario Advance games. 2 of the best Super Nintendo games, hell, games of all time right here. And now you can play them on the Game Boy Advance in the form of cartridges you could fit in like the original game's crotches. I had these 2 as a kid. These were the only Mario Advance games that I owned. I really wanted Super Mario Advance 4, Mario 3, but, you know, oh well. Life sucks. I think it's pretty interesting that they decided to go with Super Mario Bros. 2 as the first GBA game. You know, it was a launch title for the Game Boy Advance, a Super Mario Advance. Maybe it's because, you know, they already did Super Mario Bros. Deluxe on the Game Boy Color, so they were like, oh, well, let's do Mario 2 next. But that doesn't explain why they did Mario World after that. Super Mario World, Super Mario Advance 2. Yeah, the whole thing with the Mario Advance series is that they don't make any goddamn sense when it comes to numbering. You have Yoshi's Island, which a lot of people even question if that even should count as a Super Mario game. Like, it was just called Super Mario World 2 on the Super Nintendo for marketing purposes, and then they continued that tradition by calling the GBA port Super Mario Advance 3. I think they went with Mario 2, and then they quickly wanted to show, like, hey, we can do Super Nintendo games, and, you know, Mario World is the Super Nintendo game, so, you know, okay, let's do Mario World quickly after Super Mario Advance. And, you know, the notion that I said that the Game Boy Advance's identity is kind of just shrouded by the fact that, you know, so many Super Nintendo games are on it. It's kind of just a Super Nintendo to go. You know, I think it feels so much like that for me because, like, you know, there isn't really a traditional Mario game on the Game Boy Advance. They're all games like this. The Super Mario Advance games are all ports, remakes, re-releases. But as far as remakes and re-releases go, these two are pretty damn solid. I know a lot of people kind of piss all over Yoshi's Island on the Game Boy Advance because, oh man, the effects just aren't as good. You know, it's something like the Touch Fuzzy Get Dizzy stage. You know, that's an iconic stage in the original Yoshi's Island on Super Nintendo. You know, it uses the Super FX2 chip to just kind of like maximize the amount of like cool 3D effects it can do. And on Game Boy Advance, like, I don't know, I'm gonna be honest, like, this version is perfectly fine. I think people are just, they're just prudes. Like, yeah, it's not as good as the Super Nintendo game, but it's like, I don't think any of these games look as good as their Super Nintendo games. They look comparable, but like when it comes to like the color palettes, yeah, the Game Boy Advance kind of looks a little more desaturated in comparison, especially Super Mario World. The biggest problem is the fact that these games kind of were designed with the original Game Boy Advance in mind. You know, no backlit display, so they kind of had to like make the game brighter to just kind of make it so then you could actually see the damn thing on here. Of course, when they brought out the Game Boy Advance SP with a backlight, like it just kind of made the games look a little weird. Like, yeah, so this is what the game looked like all this time. This looks like shit. But hey, I grew up with these two games, and I will tell you they work great on the Game Boy Advance. Screen crunch is definitely a little lame, but, you know, hey, it still does the job. I always thought it was really cool how they added like an opening cutscene to the original Super Mario World. Like, it was really weird to me how that wasn't in the original game when I finally discovered the original Super Nintendo game. And that's just the thing, like as a kid, I didn't realize these were old ass games. I just thought they were like, oh, it's Mario on my Game Boy. So even though they didn't make an original Mario game for the Game Boy Advance, I think it was kind of cool. I think it was almost kind of worthwhile that they took this generation to just kind of re-release a lot of old stuff. So then, you know, this brand new generation of video game players kind of enjoy like Super Nintendo games, but they don't really realize they're playing old garbage. These are pretty faithful re-releases of the games. There's some new content in Yoshi's Island, not a ton of stuff in Super Mario World, but overall, you know, like, hey, these are pretty faithful. And you could definitely consider the original Super Mario Advance and Super Mario Advance 4 to be SNES games on the Game Boy Advance, simply because, like, they pretty much used the Super Mario All-Stars versions of those games as a basis for the Game Boy Advance ports. Which gets me in the mood to make even more excuses. Mario Kart Super Circuit, the Game Boy Advance version of Super Mario Kart. Sure. I just think it's kind of weird because Mario Kart Super Circuit is very much its own game, and it's not a complete recreation of the original Super Mario Kart. I mean, the character selection is different. This one has Mario Kart 64's character roster. The item selection is also different. This one has the feather item. This one doesn't. And this has a completely original selection of 20 tracks. However, you can unlock every single track that was in the original Super Mario Kart. And also the general gameplay of Mario Kart Super Circuit is very similar to Super Mario Kart, as you have, you know, the coins on the ground, for example. And on the title screen of Mario Kart Super Circuit, it has a copyright date that traces back to Super Mario Kart. And the only other time Nintendo does that on their title screens is if this is a damn remake, son. Obviously, this is kind of one of those games that's a little like, a little loosey-goosey Super Nintendo game on Game Boy Advance. You know, it kind of fits the bill, and the fact that the entirety of the Super Mario Kart track lineup is in this game as an unlockable, you know, it definitely does kind of, you know, point it more in the favor of this being a Super Nintendo game on Game Boy Advance. But it's a lot more than that. This is its very own Mario Kart. It's bad, but it's still its very own Mario Kart. And I love this game. This was like my childhood Mario Kart. You know, I can look past that and call it a steaming pile of garbage, but, you know, I mean, hey, I love this game. I'm exaggerating a lot, you know. I think this game holds up to an extent, but it's also kind of hard to, play these days. Unlike The Legend of Zelda: A Link to the Past, one of the all-time greats. This came out on Game Boy Advance in 2002. This was a year after the Oracle's games were on Game Boy Color. We went from this to this. We went from a game that's just desperately begging you to be like, please, God, take me seriously. I'm a Game Boy Color game, but I mean well. To a game that's like, hey, buddy, this is just a full-blown console Zelda game on the go. And I think A Link to the Past on Game Boy Advance is really damn good. Obviously, it's probably fair to consider like the Super Nintendo one is always going to be the de facto definitive version of the game. You do have screen crunch and A Link to the Past on Game Boy Advance, but I don't really think it affects the gameplay that much. Obviously, it's nice to see more of the screen, but, zooming into a top-down Zelda game, it's not as like a fast-paced reaction and timing focused as like a 2D Mario game is. And you know what I kind of like that I think a lot of people may not like as much? I like that they put voice clips in this game, They make Link making the sounds as like young Link from Ocarina of Time in the game, when he's slashing his sword or just doing whatever. Of course, that might be a little weird, but I do think it adds a lot more liveliness to the game. You also have that in the Super Mario Advance games, which those won't shut the fuck up. The original Mario Advance has like literally a voice clip for like everything. The game is so chatty. However, I still maintain it kind of gives a little more liveliness to the game. And on top of everything just looking and running well in A Link to the Past on Game Boy Advance, like, this is a perfectly fine way to play, especially considering it comes with a whole ass new game. Yes, bundled in with A Link to the Past on Game Boy Advance, you get Four Swords, a multiplayer Zelda game. Obviously, it's a little shorter than like a traditional Zelda game, like it's actually quite a bit shorter. I don't really think this could be sold on its own, like retail-wise. It was eventually made available on DSiWare for free, but again, it's DSiWare and it's free, so I still maintain I don't really think you could sell this standalone. But this was the first major experiment with multiplayer Zelda, which to many, it may sound a little bizarre, but like, yeah, it does work out incredibly well. Solving puzzles with multiple people, puzzles meant for multiple people, like it just works incredibly well. And it's just included here as its own separate game on like a startup menu. And if you complete Four Swords and A Link to the Past, you open up a brand new dungeon in A Link to the Past on Game Boy Advance. That's pretty sick. They don't even do that with other games that are like this, because I actually kind of started to think of games that are similar, where it's like they have like an old game re-released alongside like a new experience that's just kind of bundled in, that's kind of its own separate thing. So obviously, Super Mario 3D World plus Bowser's Fury, that's kind of following the Four Swords formula right there. Like, here's an enhanced re-release, and then in addition, here's a completely separate side thing. But the completely separate side thing in this game isn't entirely completely separate. Point 1 for A Link to the Past plus Four Swords. Yep, we're starting to keep track of points now. The entire Donkey Kong Country trilogy. This is pretty crazy that the entire lineup made it to Game Boy Advance. I would have expected like only maybe the first one, maybe the second one, but no, they finished the whole trilogy. I think it's especially surprising considering around the time of the Game Boy Advance, the original developers, Rare, were purchased by Microsoft. However, they were still allowed to make Game Boy Advance games while Microsoft was having them make home console games exclusively on Xbox. Microsoft allowed them to make Game Boy Advance games just because like they didn't really care. The Game Boy Advance, they weren't making a handheld. So fuck yeah, everybody. Rare put out It's Mr. Pants and Banjo Pilot. Thank you, Microsoft. Well, Rare still collaborated with Nintendo to pump out ports of the original Donkey Kong Country trilogy on Game Boy Advance. Results are a little funny. I felt that these ports kind of got better and better with each entry. The original Donkey Kong Country on Game Boy Advance, it isn't bad, it's just kind of weird. This is like the biggest example of like, yeah, they had to brighten things up like crazy to get these to look okay on an original Game Boy Advance model. It just looks weird. It doesn't look like this is the way the game is meant to be played or the way the game is meant to be portrayed or anything like that. It really does feel like it's trying to fit like a square peg in a round hole. Gameplay wise, they do add like some random little like mini games here and there. I mean, overall, it's much better than the previous Game Boy efforts for Donkey Kong Country on the go. Way better than Donkey Kong Land and Donkey Kong Country on Game Boy Color. It is pretty funny how every single entry in the Game Boy family has had a variant of Donkey Kong Country playable on it. But I would say this isn't really necessary to come back to whatsoever. It's cute as a little novelty, but it's like, yeah, you don't need that. But the ports kept improving. You know, Donkey Kong Country 2 was better than 1, and 3 is really interesting. The original on Super Nintendo didn't have like the original composer of the first 2 games, David Wise, make the music for 3, but he returned for the Game Boy Advance version. So this has like a completely new soundtrack, which is damn cool, but to an extent, you know, it is kind of like, you know, the original Donkey Kong Country 3, you know, the music was originally designed for that, so it is kind of weird to experience this game with like a completely new soundtrack, with some songs like having a completely different vibe and atmosphere and ambiance and all that. But overall, the Donkey Kong Country games are definitely cool to have on Game Boy Advance. But at this point, they are, you know, they are kind of novelties. To be fair, most of these re-releases are kind of novelties, but, you know, at the very least, Donkey Kong Country 1 on Game Boy Advance, oh, that is a big-time novelty. Like, this is, yeah, if I'm drunk. But third parties also got in on the fun. You know, we have Doom on the Super Nintendo. You know, this is a pretty infamous port. You know, for the Super Nintendo, it works fine, but, yeah, it is a pretty rough version of the original Doom. Game Boy Advance, on the other hand, this is a great version of Doom. It runs surprisingly well on GBA. There's also some Disney games. There was Disney's Magical Quest starring Mickey Mouse, the Capcom game on Super Nintendo. These games hit the GBA. There's also a game that was like only available in Japan originally. That was Magical Quest 3, and yeah, that made it to North America for the very first time. They also re-released Disney's Aladdin from the Super Nintendo on the Game Boy Advance, which I always forget about. I remember reading like an old Nintendo holiday gift guide catalog, and I was like, what? That got re-released on Game Boy Advance? I never heard of that. Well, how about Super Ghouls and Ghosts? There's also Contra 3, the Alien Wars, re-released as Contra Advance. A bunch of the Final Fantasy games made their way on the Game Boy Advance. We also have Earthworm Jim 1 and 2. We had Street Fighter 2, Mortal Kombat 3, Final Fight 1. Yeah, Wolfenstein 3D. Then you had Mother 1 and 2, which was Earthbound here in North America. Oh, Mega Man in Bass. Like a Super Famicom exclusive Mega Man game that finally made its way over to North America as Mega Man in Bass on the Game Boy Advance. And guess what? It sucks. Well, then we have Dr. Mario and Puzzle League, which is pretty much like, okay, we got Dr. Mario on the Super Nintendo, not the original Tetris, but then we have Tetris Attack, which is Puzzle League. So just combine half of this, all of that, boom. Are you impressed I know this much? Yeah. So the Game Boy Advance had a lot of Super Nintendo games available on it. And I know I said that kind of like brings the legacy of the whole system down a little bit. And, you know, and I do still kind of agree with that. You know, the fact that, you know, the Game Boy Advance is so kind of defined, at least I remember at the time, like it's so kind of defined by a lot of these old games available on it. But like I was saying with the Super Mario Advance games, I kind of like that. It helped raise an entire generation of gamers on some of the greatest games of all time. Without us really knowing it, we were playing great gaming history. They may not have been the best versions of the games, or they might have been the best versions of the games. You know, it always depended game to game, but overall, like, it was always pretty damn cool that Super Nintendo games were available on Game Boy Advance. You know, like throughout handheld history, we were always trying to replicate what was going on home consoles and just barely getting there. And there was always compromises. But overall, we got closer than we ever did before on Game Boy Advance. This felt like such a powerful little device for your pocket. And hey, you know, if you were gonna be any home console to go, you can't really go wrong with Super Nintendo. But hey, there is always Sega Genesis. Oh, fellas, I think this sucks.